At 79, Dolly Parton stands as one of the most recognizable women on earth. Her voice, her image, her generosity, and her relentless optimism have been etched into global culture for more than half a century. To the public, she is unbreakable. She laughs easily, turns hardship into humor, and transforms pain into songs that feel warm instead of bitter. That is why this story unsettles people. Not because it is scandalous, but because it reveals a kind of vulnerability that fame cannot protect from, and a promise that shaped an entire lifetime. For decades, there has been a quiet question hovering around Dolly Parton's life, a question repeated so often it became folklore. Who is the man she married, and why has the world never seen him? While her face filled television screens, album covers, movie posters, and theme parks, her husband remained invisible. No red carpets, no award shows, no interviews, no photographs standing beside her. In an industry where relationships are often staged, displayed, and monetized, this absence felt suspicious to outsiders. Some assumed the marriage was a myth. Others believed it was a calculated shield for a secret life. The truth, however, is far more human and far more heartbreaking. The man was real. His name was Carl Dean. He was not a performer, not an executive, not a celebrity by proximity. He ran a small asphalt paving business in Nashville and preferred a quiet, ordinary existence. When Dolly's career began to accelerate in the late 1960s, something happened that would define their marriage forever. After attending a single industry event with her, Carl realized that the public world she belonged to was not a world he could survive in. The noise, the attention, the expectations, the loss of anonymity, all of it felt unbearable to him. What followed was not an argument, and not an ultimatum. It was a promise. Carl told Dolly he loved her completely and would support her unconditionally, but he asked for one thing in return. He would never again be required to stand in that spotlight. He would not attend award shows. He would not pose for cameras. He would not become a public figure simply because of who he married. Dolly agreed. That agreement became the quiet architecture of their relationship. From that moment on, she walked red carpets alone. She accepted trophies alone. She answered questions alone. And at home, she returned to a man who remained unchanged by her fame, unimpressed by her celebrity, and grounded in a life that had nothing to do with applause. To the outside world, this looked lonely. To them, it was freedom. When Carl Dean died on March 3, 2025, after nearly 6 decades of marriage, Dolly finally began to speak more openly about what that promise meant. Not as a dramatic reveal, but as a reflection. This was not a love story built on visibility. It was built on restraint, trust, and the courage to let one person shine without stepping into their light. And now, for the first time since she was 18 years old, Dolly Parton is learning how to live without the man who chose to love her from the shadows. The foundation of this story is not fame, and it is not music. It is timing. In 1964, when Dolly Parton stepped off a bus in Nashville, she was not a star in waiting. She was a young woman carrying uncertainty, ambition, and a cardboard suitcase filled with clothes that still smelled like home. Her first stop in the city was not a recording studio or a radio station. It was a laundromat. That detail matters because it strips away the mythology and leaves only circumstance. On that ordinary day, outside that ordinary place, a man driving past noticed her standing in the sun and said something simple, something human. Not a line meant to impress, just concern. That was how Carl Dean entered her life. Carl was not chasing opportunity. He was not scanning the street for destiny. He was a working man from Nashville, running his own asphalt paving business, living a life defined by routine and independence. When he later said his first thought was that he would marry her, it was not the kind of declaration built on fantasy. It was instinct. Within days, he kept showing up. He visited her where she was staying. He came back again and again, not with grand gestures, but with consistency. Their early dates were modest. He took her to meet his parents. They ate fast food. There was no performance, no audition. It was intimacy without an audience. By the time they married in 1966, Dolly's career had begun to move, but she was not yet the global figure she would become. The marriage itself was deliberately quiet. They drove out of state to avoid press, to avoid interference from the industry that already saw her image as an investment. Only a handful of people were present. No spectacle, no announcement. It was a private commitment made before the public ever learned her name. That decision, made so early, foreshadowed everything that came next. As Dolly's visibility grew, the contrast between her life and Carl's became sharper. She entered a world built on constant exposure. He recoiled from it. When he accompanied her to a single industry event, the experience confirmed his deepest fear. The small talk, the false familiarity, the feeling of being observed rather than known, all of it left him deeply uncomfortable. That night did not end in conflict. It ended in clarity. Carl understood that if he followed her into that world, he would lose himself. And he understood that if she tried to pull him into it, she would lose him anyway. So he made a request that was both selfless and severe. He would never ask her to shrink her ambitions. He would never compete with her success. He would stand behind her completely, but he would do it from a distance. No cameras, no public role, no symbolic appearances meant to reassure strangers. In exchange, he asked for the right to remain ordinary. Dolly agreed, fully aware that this choice would be misunderstood for the rest of her life. From the outside, their marriage looked asymmetrical. She traveled constantly. She was surrounded by attention, admiration, and identified desire. He stayed home. He lived quietly. He watched her on television instead of standing beside her. But what many failed to understand was that this separation protected the core of their relationship. Carl did not become an accessory to her fame, and Dolly did not become a caretaker of his discomfort. They allowed each other to exist fully as they were. That arrangement demanded trust on a level most relationships never reach. There were rumors, assumptions, and accusations over the years. People questioned whether the marriage was real, whether it was open, whether it was lonely. Dolly answered those questions with humor, but beneath the jokes was certainty. Carl did not police her movements. She did not monitor his. They understood that loyalty did not require surveillance. Their bond was not enforced. It was chosen again and again in private. This is the crucial context for understanding the promise at the heart of their story. It was not about secrecy. It was about boundaries. Carl Dean loved a woman whose light belonged to the world, and he accepted that his role was not to stand in that light, but to protect the space where she could rest from it. That choice shaped every decade that followed, and it explains why their marriage endured when so many others collapsed under the weight of visibility. By the early 1970s, Dolly Parton had crossed a threshold that very few artists ever reach. She was no longer simply successful. She was unavoidable. Her voice was on the radio, her face on television, her name in headlines, her image shaping what country music could look like and who it could belong to. With that level of exposure came a pressure that most people never see from the outside. Fame does not only elevate. It amplifies every insecurity, every rumor, every fear that lives quietly in the background of a relationship. For Dolly, the greatest fear was not losing her career. It was losing the man who chose to love her away from the noise. Carl Dean did not resent her success, but success changed the environment around them. Strangers felt entitled to opinions about a marriage they had never witnessed. People questioned how a woman so adored could be married to a man who refused to be visible. Theories multiplied. Some accused Carl of jealousy. Others suggested he was controlling. A few insisted the relationship must be a fabrication. Dolly absorbed all of it, smiling in public, but privately she understood that love does not become immune to doubt simply because it is strong. This tension is what gave birth to one of the most famous songs in modern music history. In 1973, Dolly wrote Jolene, a song often misunderstood as a dramatic fantasy. The truth is quieter and more revealing. The emotional core of Jolene came from a real moment of vulnerability early in Dolly's marriage. Carl, a man unaccustomed to attention, enjoyed the harmless flirtation of a bank teller who made him feel noticed in a way that did not involve fame or spectacle. Dolly saw it. She felt it. And for a brief moment, she feared that the simplicity Carl cherished might be offered to him by someone who did not come with rhinestones and expectations. Dolly never confronted the situation with accusation. She turned it into music. Jolene is not a threat. It is a plea. It is the sound of a woman who knows her own power, but also knows that love cannot be commanded. When she sings about beauty and fear and insecurity, she is not performing strength. She is confessing fragility. That confession is why this song still resonates. It captures the truth that even the most celebrated woman in the room can feel replaceable in the privacy of her own marriage. Carl never left. He never considered leaving. The flirtation faded into a joke between them, a reminder that admiration does not automatically become betrayal. But the emotional impact lingered. Dolly has admitted over the years that Jolene is painful to sing because it is rooted in something real. It reminds her how close she came to understanding what loss could feel like, long before she actually experienced it. The song became a global phenomenon, yet for Dolly, it remained a personal scar turned into art. As the years passed, another quiet grief settled into their lives, one that did not involve rumors or temptation, but biology and fate. Dolly grew up in a family of 12 children. Motherhood was not an abstract dream for her. It was an expectation, almost a certainty. She and Carl assumed they would have children. They talked about names. They imagined a future that included a family of their own. But time moved forward without fulfilling that vision. In the early 1980s, Dolly was diagnosed with endometriosis, a painful condition that explained years of unexplained physical suffering. The diagnosis carried consequences that went far beyond health. In 1984, she underwent surgery that ended any remaining hope of biological children. She was 36 years old. The loss was devastating, not because it was public, but because it was permanent. For a woman who had built her identity around love, generosity, and nurturing, this felt like a quiet erasure of something she believed she was meant to be. Carl's response to this moment revealed the depth of their bond. He did not express disappointment. He did not frame their marriage as incomplete. He did not search for alternatives that would replace what was lost. He stayed. He reassured her that they were enough. Just the two of them. In an industry where men often measure relationships by legacy and lineage, Carl refused that metric entirely. His loyalty was not conditional on outcomes. It was absolute. Over time, Dolly found a way to redirect that unspent maternal instinct outward. She created the Imagination Library, a program that would eventually provide hundreds of millions of free books to children around the world. She became a cultural godmother, a source of warmth and encouragement to generations who would never sit at her kitchen table but would still feel her presence in their lives. This was not a replacement. It was a transformation. The wound never disappeared, but it evolved into purpose. Through all of this, Carl remained exactly who he had always been. He did not appear at the opening of Dollywood. He did not participate in promotional events. He did not give interviews. On the rare occasions when his presence was requested, he insisted on remaining unseen, even joking that he would rather wear a bag over his head than become a symbol. This was not defiance. It was consistency. Carl had drawn a line early in their marriage, and he never crossed it. The endurance of their relationship cannot be explained by romance alone. It was sustained by humor, distance, and an unusual honesty about jealousy and attraction. They acknowledged flirtation without fear. They trusted without surveillance. They lived parallel lives that met at home, where the world ended and the marriage began. Carl did not belong to the audience. He belonged to Dolly when the lights were off. As Carl aged, illness introduced a final challenge neither of them could negotiate away. Alzheimer's disease began to erode the man who had protected his privacy for decades. Dolly shielded him from public scrutiny even then, adjusting her schedule, returning home more often, preserving his dignity as his memory faded. There is a detail that breaks through every layer of celebrity when it is told. Even as his mind failed, Carl's face still changed when he saw her. He may not have known the day or the place, but he knew her. This is the emotional ground on which the final promise was made. Not a promise about fame or visibility, but about continuity, about love existing beyond recognition, beyond work, beyond life itself. To understand that promise, you must understand everything that came before it. A marriage built on restraint, vulnerability, acceptance, and the courage to let love exist without witnesses. When the public speaks about enduring love, it usually reaches for spectacle. Grand gestures, anniversary headlines, photographs that prove devotion exists. The marriage of Dolly Parton and Carl Dean worked in the opposite direction. It survived not because it was displayed, but because it was protected. As the decades advanced and Dolly's empire expanded, the quiet structure of their relationship became even more deliberate. Fame did not soften. It intensified. Every year brought more attention, more assumptions, more attempts to pull Carl into a narrative he never agreed to join. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dolly was no longer simply an entertainer. She was a business force. Music, film, television, publishing, philanthropy, and eventually a theme park that bore her name. Dollywood became a physical symbol of her reach. Millions of people walked through its gates, surrounded by her image, her voice, her story. And yet, within that entire world, there was one deliberate absence. Carl Dean did not appear. No statues, no plaques, no photographs. When asked to participate in promotional material, he refused unless he could do so anonymously. Even then, it was half a joke, half a boundary. He would not be turned into a character, even inside his wife's kingdom. This absence confused people because it challenged a familiar script. In most celebrity marriages, the partner becomes part of the brand whether they want to or not. Visibility is framed as support. Silence is framed as distance. But Carl's silence was not withdrawal. It was contribution. By refusing the spotlight, he preserved something essential for both of them, a private center that fame could not reach. Dolly did not have to manage his discomfort, and Carl did not have to perform enthusiasm for a life that was not his. Their daily reality reflected this separation. Dolly traveled constantly. Recording sessions, tours, film shoots, meetings, appearances. Carl stayed home in Nashville. He ran his business. He watched television. He took road trips in their recreational vehicle. He lived the same ordinary life he had chosen before she became extraordinary. When Dolly returned, she did not come home to a man reshaped by her absence. She came home to continuity. The same routines, the same humor, the same grounding presence. People often asked how they avoided jealousy in such an arrangement. Dolly's answer was always disarming in its honesty. They trusted each other completely. They acknowledged attraction without fear. They joked about flirting. They refused to treat curiosity as betrayal. This was not carelessness. It was confidence. Their bond was not threatened by attention because it was not dependent on control. Carl never demanded explanations. Dolly never imposed surveillance. They understood that loyalty enforced through suspicion eventually destroys itself. This trust was tested not by temptation, but by time. As Carl entered his later years, illness crept in quietly. Alzheimer's disease began to erode the sharpness that had defined him for so long. The man who had spent his life avoiding public attention now faced a vulnerability that could not be hidden behind humor or boundaries. Dolly responded the only way she knew how. She protected him. She adjusted her schedule. She reduced her public presence. She shielded him from exposure at a moment when exposure would have felt like betrayal. She did not turn his decline into a narrative. She did not invite sympathy through disclosure. She honored the same promise she had made decades earlier. His life would remain his own, even as it slipped away. Friends later described a painful tenderness in those final years. Carl's memory faded. Names disappeared. Details dissolved. But one recognition endured. When Dolly entered the room, his face changed. Somewhere beneath the confusion, the bond remained intact. He knew her, even when he knew little else. The final weeks of Carl's life were marked by an intimacy that no audience will ever witness. There were no speeches, no confessions designed for legacy. Just a woman sitting beside the man who had anchored her life since she was 18 years old. In those moments, the promise that defined their marriage came full circle. The original promise had been practical. He would stay invisible. She would let him. The final promise was spiritual. She would see him again, not as a performance of faith, but as reassurance, something to hold on to when language was no longer reliable. On March 3rd, 2025, Carl Dean died at the age of 82. They had been married for 58 years. For the world, this was a footnote to a legend. For Dolly, it was the end of a life shared almost entirely away from view. 2 days later, she appeared at a public event related to Dollywood. Cameras captured her smile. The image traveled quickly. Some people criticized it. Others admired it. Very few understood it. Work was not denial. It was survival. She had always known how to carry pain without surrendering function. Later, she admitted what the cameras did not show. She returned home to an empty house. She reached for habits built over decades, only to remember they were no longer needed. The absence was not dramatic. It was quiet. An empty chair, an unused place at the table, a silence that no applause could fill. For the first time since that laundromat in Nashville, she was truly alone. Music, as it always had, became the language she used when ordinary speech failed. She released a song written for Carl, thanking him for standing beside her in his own way, for believing in her without needing credit, for being her anchor while she moved through the world. It was not a goodbye meant for an audience. It was a continuation of the conversation they had been having privately for nearly 6 decades. The world finally understood what had always been misunderstood. Carl Dean was not invisible because he lacked significance. He was invisible because he chose love over recognition. He understood that Dolly's light was vast, powerful enough to illuminate millions. He also understood that if he stepped fully into that light, he would lose the life that made him who he was. So he stayed in the shadows, not out of fear, but out of devotion. Now, Dolly Parton continues on alone, still working, still creating, still smiling. But behind the public rhythm is a private certainty. She kept her promise. He kept his. Their story did not end with spectacle. It ended the same way it was lived. Quietly, faithfully, and entirely on their own terms. After Carl was gone, the silence in Dolly's life did not announce itself all at once. It arrived in fragments, in habits that no longer made sense, in routines that had lost their second half. For nearly 6 decades, her life had been divided cleanly between the public woman and the private wife. Fame filled one side completely. Carl filled the other. When he died, the balance did not collapse dramatically. It tilted, slowly and relentlessly, leaving her to discover how much of herself had been built around a presence that never demanded attention. What makes this stage of the story difficult to articulate is that Dolly did not retreat. She did not disappear. She did what she has always done. She worked. To the outside world, this looked like strength. To those closer to her, it looked like necessity. Work had always been her way of maintaining order when emotion threatened to overwhelm her. But now, the reason for returning home had changed. There was no one waiting to hear the details of her day. No quiet voice offering grounding humor. No familiar rhythm of shared solitude. Grief, for someone like Dolly, was not explosive. It was disciplined. She spoke about missing Carl in small, controlled moments. About reaching for the phone and stopping herself. About noticing the empty places in a house that had always felt lived in, even when she was gone. These were not statements meant to invite sympathy. They were acknowledgments of reality. Loss does not always scream. Sometimes it simply removes what held everything else in place. The promise she made to Carl near the end of his life became the emotional anchor of this phase. She promised she would see him again, not in the abstract language of comfort, but with conviction. This was not a public declaration of faith designed to reassure an audience. It was a private agreement meant to soothe the man whose world was narrowing rapidly. In those final moments, when memory and time were slipping away from him, the promise was not about the future. It was about peace. For Dolly, keeping that promise does not mean waiting. It means continuing. She has never framed grief as a reason to stop living. Instead, she has framed love as a reason to live well. This distinction matters. Carl did not want her to retreat from the world. He never did. His entire role in her life had been to support her forward motion without stepping into it himself. To stop now would feel like a violation of everything they built together. Yet something subtle has shifted. The humor remains. The warmth remains. The generosity remains. But there is a weight beneath it that was not visible before. Not sorrow exactly. Awareness. The awareness that the one person who saw her completely without needing anything from her is no longer there to witness the quieter moments. Fame fills rooms. Love fills space. When love leaves, the space does not shrink. It echoes. People continue to analyze their marriage as if it were an experiment. Was Carl's invisibility healthy? Was it avoidance? Was it unusual to the point of dysfunction? These questions miss the core truth. Their marriage was not designed to meet expectations. It was designed to meet needs. Carl needed privacy to remain himself. Dolly needed freedom to become herself. Neither tried to rewrite the other. They negotiated the terms honestly and lived with the consequences fully. That honesty extended to subjects most couples avoid. They spoke openly about attraction, about humor, about the necessity of distance. Dolly often joked that being apart so much kept them from getting tired of each other. Beneath the joke was an understanding that constant proximity is not the same as intimacy. Their intimacy was chosen, not enforced by circumstance. When they were together, it was deliberate. When they were apart, it was trusted. Now, in the absence of Carl, Dolly is forced to confront a new version of that distance, one that cannot be closed by returning home. This is where the true cost of loving quietly reveals itself. When a relationship is lived away from public view, its ending is also largely invisible. There are no shared memories validated by photographs, no collective mourning rituals, no external structure to hold the grief. The loss exists almost entirely within the person who lived it. Dolly has chosen to translate that private grief into something she understands. Music, not as confession, but as gratitude. The song she released after Carl's death was not a lament. It was a thank you, a recognition that her life, as expansive and improbable as it became, was made possible by a man who never asked to be acknowledged for his role in it. In the lyrics, she does not elevate herself. She centers him. She acknowledges that without his steady presence, she might have flown too far from herself to ever return. This reframing of grief as gratitude is not denial. It is integration. Carl's absence does not erase his influence. It clarifies it. Everything that remains steady in her life is, in some way, a continuation of what he gave her. The confidence to stand alone. The freedom to exist without explanation. The understanding that love does not require constant visibility to be real. As she moves forward, Dolly carries a contradiction that defines her uniquely. She is one of the most recognized figures in modern culture, and yet the most defining relationship of her life was built on anonymity. The world knows her voice, her image, her philanthropy. It will never fully know her marriage. That is not a loss. It is a boundary that held. In the end, the promise she keeps is not only about reunion. It is about legacy. Carl Dean did not leave behind interviews, quotes, or public artifacts. He left behind a woman who knows exactly who she is because someone loved her without trying to shape her. That kind of influence does not fade. It does not need documentation. It lives on in how she continues to move through the world, carrying both the light she gives and the shadow that once protected her from it. With Carl gone, Dolly Parton entered a phase of life that no amount of experience could rehearse her for. Not decline, not retirement, but recalibration. For most of her adult life, the rhythm was fixed. She moved outward into the world while something steady waited at home. That structure shaped how she took risks, how she recovered from failure, how she returned to herself after applause faded. Now the rhythm is different. The outward motion remains, but the inward return has changed form. What becomes visible in this stage is how deliberately Dolly refuses bitterness. She does not romanticize loss, but she also refuses to let it harden her. When asked about the future, she speaks carefully, often redirecting attention toward gratitude. This is not evasion. It is discipline. She understands that grief can become an identity if it is fed too openly. Carl never wanted to be a symbol. She will not turn his absence into one. Her work continues, but its tone subtly shifts. There is less urgency to prove, less appetite for expansion. The drive now is stewardship rather than conquest. Projects are chosen with an eye toward meaning rather than momentum. She talks more openly about legacy, not as an endpoint, but as a responsibility. What does it mean to have been given so much attention, so much reach, and still remain answerable to something quiet and personal? In interviews, she returns again and again to a simple idea. Love does not end when a person leaves. It changes shape. This belief anchors her public composure. It allows her to speak about Carl without collapsing into nostalgia or pain. She does not say she has moved on. She says she has moved forward with him still present in a different way. That distinction matters. It keeps the relationship alive without trapping her inside it. Observers often ask whether the invisibility that once protected their marriage now complicates her grief. Without shared public memories, without a visible archive of life together, does mourning become harder? Dolly's answer, implicitly, is no. Privacy was not an absence. It was a choice. The memories that matter most were never meant for witnesses. They live where cameras never entered. That is why they remain intact. There's also a clarity now about why their arrangement worked. Carl did not disappear to punish the world or control her image. He disappeared to preserve his sense of self. Dolly honored that because she understood that love, which demands transformation, eventually demands resentment. By letting him remain who he was, she preserved who she could become. That mutual permission outlasted youth, fame, illness, and time. As she ages, Dolly speaks more openly about mortality, but without fear. The promise she made to Carl is not treated as a countdown. It is treated as a horizon, something distant enough to keep her grounded, close enough to keep her honest. She does not frame death as reunion alone, but as completion. A closing of a long arc that began outside a laundromat with a stranger who spoke to her like a person, not a possibility. This perspective reshapes how she engages with the world now. There is a softness to her public presence that feels earned rather than strategic. When she laughs, it carries weight. When she pauses, it feels intentional. She no longer needs to defend her choices. The questions that once chased her have lost their urgency. Who was Carl Dean? Why did he stay invisible? The answers matter less now because the result is undeniable. They stayed married. They stayed kind. They stayed true to the terms they set for themselves. The enduring lesson of their story is not that invisibility is ideal or that fame is corrosive. It is that relationships endure when both people are allowed to remain whole. Carl never tried to become part of Dolly's legend. Dolly never tried to pull him into it. They met as equals in difference and protected that difference as the years passed. Now, as Dolly continues on alone, she carries that lesson forward. She does not fill the silence with noise. She does not rush to replace what cannot be replaced. She lives inside the space they built together, even as it changes shape. The love that once stayed in the shadows now lives openly in her work, her words, and her restraint. In that sense, Carl is still doing what he always did. He is not visible. He is not speaking, but he is present, quietly shaping how she moves through the world. And Dolly, as she always has, keeps her promise by continuing to be exactly who she is, without asking anyone else to stand in her light. At 79, Dolly Parton does not speak about love as something dramatic or fragile. She speaks about it as something chosen, maintained, and protected. When a story of her marriage is viewed from a distance, it can look unusual, even contradictory. A woman whose life was built on visibility shared nearly 6 decades with a man who refused it entirely. But when the noise is stripped away, what remains is not mystery. It is clarity. Carl Dean did not vanish from public life because he lacked confidence, ambition, or devotion. He vanished because he understood something most people never articulate. Love does not require witnesses. It requires alignment. He knew who he was, and he knew who Dolly needed to become. Instead of competing with her growth or reshaping himself to match it, he stepped aside and let her expand. That decision was not passive. It was deliberate, sustained, and deeply loving. For Dolly, honoring that choice became an act of loyalty repeated daily. She accepted that some parts of her life would never be validated by photographs or public memory. She learned to answer questions without explaining everything. She learned to protect what mattered from curiosity that did not deserve access. Over time, this restraint became a strength. It allowed her to move through a career defined by excess without losing a private core that remained untouched. Now, with Carl gone, that core is still there. It has changed, but it has not collapsed. The house is quieter. The routines are different. The presence that once anchored her evenings is no longer physical. Yet the influence remains unmistakable. The calm in her voice, the refusal to sensationalize grief, the insistence on gratitude over regret. These are not performance choices. They are habits formed through a lifetime of being loved without conditions. The world often celebrates relationships that burn brightly and end loudly. This one did neither. It endured quietly and concluded without spectacle. That is why it feels unfamiliar. There are no scandals to dissect, no betrayals to resolve, no public reconciliations to memorialize. Just two people who met young, made a difficult agreement, and kept it for nearly 6 decades. The promise at the center of this story was never about disappearance alone. It was about trust. Carl trusted Dolly to live fully without him beside her in public. Dolly trusted Carl to remain steady without her beside him in private. When illness erased his memory, that trust did not dissolve. When death ended his presence, it did not disappear. It simply changed form. In the end, the question is not whether Carl's choice was strange or selfless. The question is whether it worked. The answer is clear. They stayed married. They stayed faithful. They stayed kind. In an industry that consumes relationships as entertainment, they built one that resisted consumption entirely. Dolly continues forward now, not carrying a legend, but carrying a life that was shaped by someone who never wanted credit for shaping it. That is the quiet truth of their story. Love does not always ask to be seen. Sometimes it asks only to be honored. And that is exactly what Dolly Parton continues to do.